The first thing that you have to understand about Jeffrey Epstein is that his story didn't begin with his arrest. I'm honestly not sure that it ended with his death either. It didn't begin on a Manhattan sidewalk in front of a posh townhouse he was given, or inside a federal courthouse, or even in the public shock that followed when his name finally became impossible to simply ignore or to hide. It did not begin with headlines or mugshots or the belated questions from people who should have been asking them years earlier. Before the sweetheart deal, before the whispers of intelligence connections, before the media finally caught up to a story that many very powerful people not only knew well, but that many were an active part of. No, it began much earlier than all of that. It began in the invisible spaces where money becomes access, access becomes immunity, and immunity becomes a shield that surrounds certain people and keeps them insulated from consequences. It began in the places where clear warnings are noticed, and then brushed off, and finally just swept under the rug until they pile up too high to be hidden, where victims are disbelieved, where institutions see enough to know better and then still choose to keep looking the other way, where the public is always last to be told what the powerful have long known, and perhaps more than any other time in recent history. On July 6 of 2019, all of that came roaring into view as a vast web of protection and apathy began collapsing around the man at the center. Not because the system had changed, it rarely ever has. Not because justice had finally grown a spine, and not even because the powerful individuals who built and enabled Epstein had finally been exposed or forced to answer for what they know, for what they did. But because, for one brief moment, the machinery running behind it all failed to keep him out of sight. That morning, things finally went into motion to apprehend someone who we were told was the most prolific pedophile in history. At approximately 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Jeffrey Epstein's posh private jet touched down at the Teterboro Airport in New Jersey as Epstein was returning home from Paris, France. Waiting for him was NYPD detectives and agents from the FBI. The accusations from victims have been piling up quicker than ever lately. The elite shielding that had allowed him to skirt real prosecution for years was no longer able to stem the tide of mounting evidence, and the walls were slowly closing in on a man who should have been stopped decades before. He would be charged with only a single count of sex trafficking of minors, and a single count of conspiracy to commit it, not for the years of statutory rape or thousands of victims that he left in his wake, not a peep about his elite enablers or patrons. And in the ever-sterile language of official process, that arrest sounded almost banal, routine even. A man was taken into custody. A case was filed in the District Court of New York. A legal mechanism had at long last finally began to move. But the reality behind that moment was anything but routine. Because by the time Epstein was arrested, the public already had reason to ask a far more disturbing question. Not how he had slipped between the cracks, but how is it that he had not only survived the first exposure in 2005, and then still gone on to be equally, if not more, predatory and connected, and what kind of system supposedly built on equal justice was willing to sign off on that survival? How could a man with this much money, this much access, this many private properties, this many powerful associations, even after his first arrest, and this much smoke around him manage to keep moving so freely or so beneath the radar for so long? How does such a person survive, much less thrive, so prolifically in plain sight? And perhaps even more importantly, who all were out there making sure that he could? This is one of the key questions at the heart of this series, because despite what so many would have you believe, Epstein wasn't simply some predator operating in isolation and trafficking to himself. He was no lone deviant who just somehow slipped through the cracks of a system that was otherwise functioning as intended. The more you dig, the more you find, and the more that a very different picture begins to come into clear view. A picture of repeated failures that are too consistent to be accidental, too convenient to be coincidence, and far too structurally useful to dismiss as simple incompetence. The story keeps pointing in the same directions, ones that I pointed out back in part 3 of the Franklin series, and that I intend to blow wide open throughout the course of this one, towards networks, intermediaries, facilitators, and institutional corruption and complicity, into wealthy circles of so-called elites where connections overlap, favors are currency, and the value of silence above all else is deeply understood. We will be stepping into a world where true power doesn't always announce itself with titles and press releases, but with doors that open quietly, favors that are extended without paper trails, and reputations that are maintained by mutual self-interest. As the late great George Carlin once put it so eloquently, you don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge. These people went to the same universities and fraternities, and they're on the same boards of directors. They're at the same country clubs. They have like interests. They don't need to call a meeting. They know what's good for them. And that world was already there long before Epstein was even born. He didn't invent it, he was just one of the best at exploiting it. And if you really want to understand how he operated and why it seems to have been shielded for so long, you need to first understand the world that made him possible to begin with. That means going back before the headlines, before the 2019 arrest or even the 2005 one, before the plea deal that never should have happened. Back before the myths and the speculation, the media panic, or the carefully managed fragments of accountability that followed. We need to go back to earlier failures, how the system that gave rise to Epstein was formed and why. And if you take this journey with me and go back far enough, you start to see something else, something far more systemic. You'll come to realize that Epstein wasn't the first man who benefited from this kind of insulation, and he certainly won't be the last. He wasn't the first man to build his life around social access, secrecy, or the concentration of power in spaces that us ordinary folks were never meant to see, much less to ever enter. See, Epstein was in many ways a later expression of a much older pattern. This is why the real story can't be told as just another criminal case. It has to be told as an indictment on the very system itself, the one that creates, replicates, facilitates, sustains, and eventually disposes of people like Epstein, all to cover its own tracks. Because what Epstein threatened to finally reveal wasn't the depravity of one man, or even his elite circle, but the presence and durability of the system that necessitated and protected him. It didn't appear overnight. It was carefully built, layer by layer, through wealth, through legitimacy, through introductions, favors, secrets, through social permission, and through institutions that benefited from the blackmail that it all provided. See, this is the part of the real story that most people miss, or they avoid out of fear of its implications or repercussions. They tend to focus solely on the crimes, which, sure, are horrifying enough. But even the worst of his crimes are only scum along the surface of this cesspool. The deeper story also involves the infrastructure around them, the social architecture, the elite ecosystem that makes it possible, and machinery of systemic protection. Because once you have the whole picture, Epstein stops looking like an isolated scandal. It starts looking a lot like a recurring pattern. And that pattern doesn't belong to any one man or decade. It stretches, repeats, and adapts over and over. It tends to pop up whenever obscene wealth and secrecy converge into something private and powerful enough to resist scrutiny. It isn't about whether the crimes of one man were visible enough. They were. It's about whether anyone with the power to act wanted to, and if so, why they didn't. Because that question sits beneath everything that follows in this series. Not just who he was or what he did, but how he was able to exist inside such a cocoon of prestige, wealth, connections, and protection without being stopped any sooner. Once you start asking that question honestly, this case ceases being about one predator and starts being about the system that allowed it. And that story starts way back with an all-but-forgotten man named George Huntington Hartford II. Where it all ends is with a first-of-its-kind comprehensive reckoning that has been 7 years in the making so far. So if you're ready to look past the cases and the headlines and dig deeper than the story that we've all been sold, and take this little trip into the belly of the beast with me, then buckle up. It's going to be one hell of a ride.
Welcome to Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 4.
I don't know, I guess I just had the ambition to talk to people this year, bring back the interview format. I also still try to do several deep dives and cover some topics that I've really been wanting to get to and never had a chance to. And I guess just hope that everybody's willing to come along for the ride. Good evening, curious minds out there across the world. As always, I'm your host, DJ Joswa, and this is File 002, Epstein, Part 1, The Making of a Monster. I want to thank you guys for joining me tonight, as always, for what I feel will be the most comprehensive deep dive into this material yet. It's been a multi-year epic investigation. One that I was already working on, actually, when I started this podcast, and At that point I had for several years already. As I'm sure that you all have no doubt noticed at this point, this story is kind of unlike any other for the reason that it really threatens the entire power structure of the so-called elites as we know it. It was clearly more than the two people that they told us to focus on, much, much more. Now, I don't want to waste too much of your time up here up front because we have a ton to cover throughout this, and even tonight. You may want to take a few notes as we go because you're probably going to learn a lot of new names, people that were key to all of this happening, and this will be the most detailed deep dive that I've ever done. Maybe pack a snack, fix a beverage, get comfy, because we've got a lot to get into. I do need to give a quick warning. While this episode doesn't directly deal with this sexual abuse, they will become more and more prominent as we go. For the sake of keeping this up and freely available to all, hopefully, I will avoid getting any more graphic on this material than is absolutely necessary to try to convey the severity of the crimes that are involved. That being said, though, if you feel that this material may trigger past trauma or cause you great distress, you may want to just skip the later episodes of this series. No hard feelings. I completely understand. I would rather you guys be comfortable and not have to deal with any undue stress. For everyone else, without further ado, welcome to File 002, Epstein, Part 1, The Making of a Monster. Chapter 1, The Patterns Persist. Before George Huntington Hartford II ever became a name attached to private islands, art patronage, and the strange excesses of inherited wealth, there was the fortune itself and the man who made it. His grandfather and namesake, George Huntington Hartford, took over the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, building one of the largest retail empires in the world by pioneering the concept of chain grocery stores. By the time Hartford II was 6 years old, the family fortune had already placed him inside of a life that most people couldn't even imagine. An annual salary income at 6 of roughly $1.5 million. Not because he had done anything, obviously, but because the structure of power had already been built around him. The income that he was receiving began flowing in following his grandfather's death through a trust that he had set up. While Hartford II's father also worked for A&P, the family fortune and generational wealth stemmed from Hartford I. Hartford II's father, Edward, didn't have the same hunger for wealth accumulation as his father, or even his brothers had. He would even start to distance himself from the business and from that side of the family altogether, even once stating that, quote, one Hartford ought to be a gentleman. He would also be the only one among his brothers to attend college. He would also go on to create a smaller fortune for himself by creating the Hartford shock absorber, an invention that drastically improved the ride comfort and control of cars in the early 1900s. Edward would break all contact with his brothers and father, something that he would also go on to do to Hartford II as well. And his mother was exactly the opposite, a smothering force in his life and widely known to be controlling and domineering. His raising, while privileged, would leave his emotional development stunted in many ways. He would lose his father Edward at age 11 in 1922. 9 years later, he would marry, but it would be short-lived, typically blamed on George's infidelity and because he had impregnated another woman. By 1934, George had graduated from Harvard and spent some years sailing all over and participating in ocean races. He would also soon begin working for his uncles at the A&P Company's headquarters. His uncles weren't about to let his employment in the company be a cakewalk, however, and they would stick him in a statistical job where he was in charge of the department that was responsible for tracking sales of certain items. It wouldn't take long before the tedious grind of tracking numbers would lose George's interest altogether. It's said, though sources are pretty sparse, that he would take a day off of work to go watch a football game between his alma mater, Harvard, against Yale, that would end with Harvard losing the match and with George being fired from his position in the family business. From here on, he would start taking shots at creating his own business empire. In 1940, George would invest $100,000, or around $2.5 million today, to help launch a newspaper along with Marshall Field III, who with a name like that I can only assume was also a trust fund baby. And so I actually looked into him too. Yeah, he totally was, by the way. He was the heir to the Marshall Field department store fortune. Go figure. And these two trust fund kids would start PM, a liberal-leaning daily newspaper out of New York. It's kind of its own whole story, but needless to say, it didn't really work out. George would work as a reporter there briefly. Then during World War II, he would be commissioned in the Coast Guard and given command over the Army supply ship FS-179. which, despite having been an avid sailor, he still managed to run aground not once, but twice. After the end of the war, George would make the move out west to L.A., where he would again start slinging money around to see what would stick. He attempted to buy Republic Pictures and RKO Studios from none other than Howard Hughes, but he was unsuccessful. In '48, George would launch a modeling agency in L.A. so that he could, quote, be with girls. This is where the first of many repeating patterns would begin, as it is also, allegedly, where his employees would be sent out to pick up young girls off the streets for his sexual pleasures. Throughout the 40s and 50s, he would attempt to make a name in the art world, and later in film, as well as starting to acquire multiple properties that included a penthouse duplex spanning the 13th and 14th floors of One Beekman Place in Manhattan, a home that he named Pompano in Palm Beach, a 150-acre estate in Manwa, New Jersey, called Melody Farm, a 160-acre Hollywood estate known as The Pines, a townhouse in London, a home in the south of France, and what would come to be his most nefarious residence on Paradise Island in the Bahamas. Virtually all of his endeavors would inevitably fail, though, largely due to never having a cohesive or coherent vision for what he actually wanted to do. But we will get into that in just a second. When George purchased his Bahamas residence, it was actually on an island called Hog Island. He would later purchase the entire island, changing it to the better-known name of Paradise Island. During this time, he also managed to woo a former nightclub cigarette girl, later turned teenage actress named Marjorie Steele, who was at that time already engaged to Charlie Chaplin's son. The 50s would be some of his most productive years, with him producing the film Hello Out There to kick off the decade. His new wife, Marjorie, became an aspiring artist and actress. He would begin investing in the film industry more and more, even producing one of Marjorie's more successful movies in '51. He would also found a, quote, artist colony and opened a theater in Hollywood. He would begin investing in more and more projects in ever grander scales, all of which would fail miserably under his leadership. By the end of the 50s, his marriage to Marjorie was also failing. As this was ending, he would return to doing what he had briefly began back on Paradise Island, and a major reason that I'm even telling you about this guy to begin with. That being organizing, quote, elite sex parties. He was also regularly a participant at a man named Hod Dibbon's London-based sex parties, one that would become famous for their outlandish and even satanic themes. Dibbons was a hell of a character himself, a British nightclub owner and antiques dealer who would go on to play a major role in the scandal that brought down the British government in the Profumo affair. He and his wife, Mariella Capes, a.k.a. Novotny, also a hell of a character but way too much to cover here, began hosting these sex parties for the London elites, such as the infamous Feast of the Peacocks sex party. Just go look it up. After fleeing FBI capture following her arrest for her involvement in a, quote, sex for sale case that, according to FBI documents, involved men in, quote, high elective offices in the United States government. The charges against her and her accomplice, Harry Allen Towers, would later be dropped, of course. Quick aside, in '73, she would write a book called, quote, King's Road, discussing her many famous lovers and their supposed fictionalized setting. But she was closely linked to lords and counts and apparently, or supposedly, even took part in one of the elite sex parties while in the U.S. that involved both Kennedy brothers. In 1980, she announced that she was writing a tell-all book about her life and all of her encounters. The book would never make it to publishing because a few years after that announcement, in what will no doubt be familiar to those who heard last season, she would be found dead at her home sitting up in bed. The coroner would rule it, quote, death by misadventure, or a drug overdose, and a few days later, her home would be broken into and all of her work on said book, note files, and diaries would magically disappear. Anyway, back to our story. Intel agencies, which were just finding their footing around this time and starting to rapidly expand in scope and scale, quickly learned what was an old mafia trick, really, that these sex parties were a prime place to gather compromising information on powerful people, which made men like Horace Hod Dibbon and George Huntington Hartford II useful allies in these endeavors for various intel agencies. George, like Hod, provided access to their many powerful companions and connections to a secretive world where their most devious sexual desires weren't only allowed but were encouraged. All in a world insulated by the privacy that only great wealth and influence can afford you. Swimming these sorts of waters, however, will inevitably draw even bigger and darker sharks. That's a story for another day, though. For now, just know that knowingly or unknowingly, George became entwined with intel operatives during these years, though no direct link between himself and any intelligence agency has ever been documented, at least not publicly. But when I say they were all around him, they were all around him. In the 60s, he would begin retreating to Paradise Island, but would remain a tabloid fixture for most of his life, largely due to his interest and involvement with, quote, young women. In '62, he would host over 1,000 guests at his lavish opening party for his Paradise Island Ocean Club resort. That lasted for days and involved such notable guests as Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley, and two guys there that also liked him pretty young, Zsa Zsa Gabor, and many others. He was well known to spend his time in New York and Hollywood, surrounded by, quote, an armada of young women, per a Vanity Fair article, and for being a compulsive womanizer. According to biographers and reports discussing the quote-unquote secret history of his island, his personal life involved a, quote, lifelong sexual interest in teenage girls, and reports have claimed that he held debaucherous, sometimes BDSM and occult-themed sex parties at his residence/ocean club or his private villa. His full story is one of scandal and intrigue, and a cautionary tale about the excess of inheriting vast sums of money and throwing it around without any clear plan at whatever carnal or social desire one might have. A single example among many of what could reasonably be called a sort of proto-Epstein, a man who existed within and was long shielded by his vast unearned wealth and the privacy that it afforded him and his companions, as well as a magnet for spooks seeking compromise on the many powerful men he drew into his orbit. While his story, of which this was only a very abbreviated example, differs from that of Epstein in many ways, the patterns, no doubt, still persist. Wealthy and powerful people seeking out someone within their class to help provide them with their darkest and most deplorable desires. Yet another node on our map and an example of how the most powerful prey on the least to satiate their perversions. Chapter 2. Inner Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein, as we discussed previously, was born on January 20th, 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, to a working-class Jewish family, but largely grew up in the Seagate neighborhood at the very tip end of Coney Island. He was regarded as a gifted student early on and was able to actually skip a few grades during high school. He would graduate at 16 from Lafayette High School in '69 before going on to college at Cooper Union from '69 to '71 and then the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences at NYU for 3 years, but he never graduated. And this is where his story, for our intents and purposes, would truly begin. Because before Epstein came to be known as a financier or a fixer, before the island, before the private jets and endless swirl of powerful names, there was a much quieter, albeit no less suspicious moment. A moment that should have been impossible. While we've seen how wealth and power grants access, and many seem to feel this accounts for Epstein's infiltration into elite spaces, there's plenty of evidence that points towards the access appearing long before any reason that would justify it. It's hard to get a firm grasp on what exactly Epstein planned to do with his life early on. Despite his early graduation and years spent spinning his wheels in college, he dropped out without any degree or even any certifications. On paper, he looks aimless, unqualified for even most entry-level positions, particularly in his chosen fields of study. By all meaningful metrics, it appeared that he was headed nowhere fast. Yet a door would open for him, a door that far more qualified applicants would have failed to have been able to walk through. In 1974, at the age of 21, Jeffrey Epstein was hired to teach math and physics at the Dalton School. Dalton, a name that may not carry much weight for those unfamiliar with it, but it was one of Manhattan's most elite prep schools. It was the kind of place where the children of the city's most influential families are sent to be prepared for Ivy League admissions, boardrooms, fraternal orders, and the quiet networks of power that actually run the world. Again, with no degree. He didn't even have a teaching credential or any of the usual markers that would explain why a school such as Dalton would open its doors to him. And yet, there he was. He was a college dropout standing in front of classrooms full of the city's most privileged students. This unknown and woefully underqualified on paper at least guy from an average working-class home teaching the kids of Wall Street executives in the upper crust of New York high society, moving through the hallways of an institution that, by all logic, should have been closed off to him. While I have no way to say with complete certainty how he pulled this off, I think a possibility that we shouldn't overlook rests within the school's leadership. More specifically, as we discussed at the end of the Franklin series, the headmaster during this time was Donald Barr, father of the future Attorney General William Bill Barr, who would, of course, preside over the case when Epstein would die in prison, but we have a ways to go before then. Before Donald Barr was an educator and Dalton headmaster, he had previously served in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, the OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency that would go on to become the CIA. While I can't say with any conviction that this had any hand in his hiring, it at least helps to illustrate that Epstein's brushes and intermingling with intel agencies may go all the way back to the very beginning. While it's been dismissed as Barr simply making, quote, unconventional hires, and favoring to hire younger people in their early 20s, it was still highly unusual for a teacher to be as young as Epstein and also lack any formal degree. One might be forgiven for thinking that he probably just tried keeping his head down and worked hard after all of this, after somehow convincing Barr to hire him, who also wrote novels about pedo upper-class aliens, if you recall from our Franklin series. But alas, you'd be wrong. He stood out from the very start, according to former students who recall him wandering the halls in a fur coat and half-buttoned or very low-cut shirts, exposing gold chains over his open chest. Others described him as being flamboyant, as if that outfit wasn't doing enough of the heavy lifting in that department already, having a thick New York accent and being very high energy and dynamic, a pretty far cry from his earlier descriptions of being a quiet or shy and frequently called a nerd kind of guy. And while some remember him as a charismatic man, many others felt that he often blurred the lines between teacher and student, and saw his frequent appearances at student social events outside of school and hanging around girl students during non-teaching hours as inappropriate and over the line. Quick pause here for me to interject. You will probably, no doubt, hear a whole bunch of hammering while I'm trying to deliver all of this information to you. That is because some little old lady that lives on the other side of the wall of my studio apparently has Sarah Winchester syndrome and has constantly hammered since she moved in months ago. I try to overlook it. I'm going to do my best to try to get it out of there in post, but without a doubt you're going to hear that. So try to ignore it, and I'll do my best to get through all this. Epstein was, without a doubt, the kind of teacher who made an impression. The kind that crossed boundaries that other faculty would never dare to. Oddly enough, even after the departure of Donald Barr as the headmaster, he would never even so much as get rowed up, despite all the alleged complaints. While he was there, he also tutored the children of Alan Ace Greenberg, who was an up-and-coming and about to be CEO of Bear Stearns, and when a routine performance review following the 75 to 76 school year said that he wasn't meeting expectations, that connection with Greenberg would open the next door of his unqualified rise to unfathomable wealth and power. After being dismissed for poor performance, Greenberg would offer him a job at Bear Stearns, joining in 76 as a low-level junior assistant to a floor trader. Within seemingly no time at all, he would move up to become an options trader, working in their special products division, and then advising the bank's wealthiest clients on tax mitigation strategies, an area that many would later turn to him for long after he left Bear Stearns. What's striking about this moment, and it is striking, is how early Epstein somehow shows up inside elite spaces that most will work their entire life and never even brush up against. Not merely scraping by on the edges either, not waiting for his chance, but already positioned where money and access are made. Somehow, already inside of a world that should have required years of credentials, connections, and conventional success to ever enter. Dalton wasn't a lucky break. It was a permission slip. The first one, anyway. And the question it raises is quite simple. Who was handing those out? This will be a major question that I'll endeavor to answer throughout this series. Because from Dalton, the path didn't narrow, it widened greatly. A single connection from that school led to Bear Stearns, where he would quickly impress and in no time at all become a limited partner, and begin building the kind of deep financial network that would later make him indispensable, at least to certain kinds of people. This is another pattern that starts to emerge. Not a straight line of merit and hustle, but a series of doors opening just wide enough. A headmaster with an OSS background, whose son was already working at the CIA, hires an unknown and underqualified teacher. A powerful Wall Street CEO notices him tutoring his kids, and suddenly a man with no obvious qualifications aside from a knack for math is moving through the most exclusive corridors of New York's financial and social world. Epstein wasn't born into the kind of dynastic wealth that shaped someone like Hartford II. He didn't inherit an empire, but in another way he was still being placed. Still being given access to spaces where the normal rules didn't seem to apply. And that is what makes the early part of his story so revealing. It's not just about one man's ambition. It's about the bars, pun intended, that were lowered and the doors that slid open to facilitate it. So the question hanging over all of this is not whether Epstein was qualified or talented enough to pull this off. It's whether the doors were already being held open, and if so, by whom. Because only 24 years later, he would be back living only 18 blocks from the school where it all began, in a 7-story mansion now worth $77 million, that he acquired as a quote-unquote gift, and it was only one of several posh homes where investigators would later say he and his powerful friends would do unspeakable things to young girls, possibly even babies. So our next question is, How did he manage to get there from here? One person who might help to answer that question is our old octopus friend and former Israeli intel officer, Ari Ben Menashe. But first, we need a few more pieces into this puzzle. Chapter 3. It's all about the Benjamins, the people who birthed a monster. The 1980s was a decade of decadence, and was characterized by a heavy focus on materialism, consumerism, and a focus on wealth, and fueled by a whole lot of cocaine. Many conditions and the convergence of all of them, virtually all at once, fueled this unprecedented push towards excess. And of course, the cocaine didn't hurt either. Some of those factors were the Reaganomics deregulation of financial markets that loosened the rules that were previously regulating banks, securities, corporate takeovers, increasing leverage and speculative trading. An effort by the central banks to drive down very high interest rates lowered borrowing costs and fueled credit expansion for consumers, corporations, and property investors in peak can-kicking fashion. What was previously reined in during the economic struggles of the 70s now opened up an expansion of consumer and corporate credit through credit cards, loans, junk bonds, and a whole host of speculative corporate finance. New assets became tradable in areas like utilities and industry, often triggering massive short-term gains. Booming stock and real estate markets created wealth that in turn boosted consumerism while increasing the demand for more credit. So together, cheaper and more abundant credit, lower regulation, tax, and policy incentives, and financial innovation created the perfect environment for those in a position to capitalize, at least, where leverage and speculation and conspicuous consumption became economically viable and culturally reinforced. And right there, perfectly poised to capitalize on all of this, was Epstein, who at this point was living life in the fast lane, with days on Wall Street and nights spent living it up among Manhattan's social and financial elite. Here he was, somehow infiltrating yet another exclusive section of society, and likely starting to feel that he could have whatever he wanted, and little to nothing was off limits. When Alan Greenberg brought Epstein in at Bear Stearns, he was clearly doing more than offering him a job. He was taking him on in a mentorship role and grooming him to have an upper, even leadership position with the company. Greenberg told him that he wanted him to learn each area of the business, and he was viewed as Greenberg's personally chosen protege. Epstein would quickly put his intellect and fluency with numbers to work that also allowed his unscrupulous ability to find and exploit flaws in these sorts of systems truly start to shine. Him getting into Wall Street pre-banking boom allowed him to not only easily put together a decent portfolio, but to build a vast network of connections among New York's elite, and all during one of the most profitable and prosperous decades that the city had ever seen. Still, it wasn't his actual skill that propelled him. It was his ability to seem far more skillful than he really was, and his skills of manipulation that took him the furthest. A former friend of him during this period and a Vanity Fair contributor named Jesse Kornbluth would tell investigative reporter Andy Tillett, as cited in the book Epstein, Dead Men Tell No Tales, that, quote, Jeffrey Epstein's money, how much there was, how he got it, is a complete mystery and not just to me. He would go on to say, quote, brighter minds than I say that he had actually really very little ability, that his mind skittered, that when the conversation turned serious, he made an ironic joke and changed it. Also adding that Epstein, quote, had enough knowledge to talk for 5 minutes about anything, and for 6 minutes about none. Kornbluth would slowly begin to see through Epstein's facade, and see more and more the longer that he was around him, that caused him to question if he was really anything that he claimed to be. Their friendship would end at the start of Jesse's marriage, when Epstein called his wife the night before the wedding asking her to sleep with him. And then days later, someone claiming to be Jesse called a number of women, some friends of his and his wife's, asking them out. The friends would, of course, call Jesse to say that someone was impersonating him. Jesse's wife always believed that it was Epstein. Around this time, things were also starting to spiral at Bear Stearns, as one of his colleagues reported to management that he was pushing the boundaries of the law and even making outright illegal moves. Stearns would investigate the claims, and Epstein would eventually admit that he had loaned his friend Warren Eisenstein $20,000 to invest and used Epstein's insider knowledge, as well as had Epstein advise him on it. This would only result in a $2,500 fine and him allegedly being passed over for a full partnership promotion. The whole thing would have been handled in-house and swept under the rug had the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, not opened an investigation only days later into one of Epstein's clients, Edgar Bronfman, in connection with Epstein's illegal securities violations. The views seem to split from here, from all that I've seen, on whether Epstein was quietly let go or if he quit in a blaze of glory and indignation, but either way, his first real con was publicly, at least, brought to a close. During this same time period, 1981 to be exact, another very significant thing took place. Epstein would take a trip with his then-girlfriend, Paula Fisher, to the UK, where he would make another serendipitous connection by meeting the one and only Douglas Leese. Leese, for all those who are unaware, was an aristocratic businessman arms dealer who was widely known and cited in court documents as an intelligence quote-unquote fixer, with those same U.S. court documents describing Leese's activities as involving, quote, highly sensitive and confidential information, at least some of which was classified by the U.S. Department of Defense and CIA. He made a small fortune for his role in facilitating the Al-Yamama deal, which sounds like a bad joke, but it was actually the largest arms contract in UK history and involved selling British fighter jets to Saudi Arabia. Leese had deep ties to MI6 as well as the Mossad. Leese would soon become a sort of early mentor to Epstein. It was most likely who taught Epstein about how the global honeypot traps function. It is known, however, and supported by Stephen Hoffenberg, whom we will meet shortly, that Leese mentored Epstein in the world of specific tradecraft of the, quote, intelligence-adjacent arms world, including moving money safely offshore, creating shell companies, and arms smuggling, all tools that would become significant elements in Epstein's come-up. Leese would play a pivotal role in introducing Epstein to British and international elites, as well as two other very important people in all of this, those being Robert Maxwell and Adnan Khashoggi. About this same time, he would be let go from Bear Stearns, again, publicly, and would strike up with a fairly short-lived business partnership in J. Stanley Pottinger, a former U.S. DOJ official who had been pushed out following an investigation into his role in dealing arms to the Islamic Republic of Iran. As we dug into during the Octopus series, which if you haven't heard that, I would strongly recommend going back and listening to that first, because all of this will make a lot more sense, I promise. From 1981 to 86, the Reagan administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran, who were in a war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and using those profits to then fund both CIA black projects, as well as to fund and arm anti-communist militias in Nicaragua. Israel was also selling Iran arms and served as the U.S.'s intermediary. Now, why all of this matters while Epstein and Pottinger's business was on the surface, advising wealthy clients on ways to skirt tax laws, it would certainly seem that there was much more going on beneath the surface. As demand for arms deals to Iran increased throughout the mid-80s, bigger and bigger arms dealers stepped in to fill that demand, with one of the biggest players in the entire game, none other than our octopus friend Adnan Khashoggi, who would become more and more central to the operation and was listed as a quote-unquote client of Epstein's consulting firm, International Assets Group. Interestingly enough, years later when the feds gained access to the large wall safe in Epstein's Manhattan Palace, a fake Austrian passport listing Epstein's residence as being in Saudi Arabia would be found among the other fake and real passports and blackmail material that we will never learn anything else about, probably. While clearly playing the role of financial fixer, at least for Leese and Khashoggi, his exact role in intelligence ties goes far deeper. Epstein, as I can prove without any doubt at this point, was very closely tied to Israeli intel and lobbying circles, which actually overlap considerably, a thing that should enrage all U.S. citizens, or at bare minimum give them pause and force them to reconsider our relationship with our quote-unquote closest ally. The connection that would ultimately prove to have the greatest effect on his life, however, was meeting Robert Maxwell. Maxwell was born in 1923 to a Hasidic Jewish family from Czechoslovakia. He would escape the German occupation and served in the British Army as an intel officer. He was also well known to have had ties to MI6, Mossad, and the KGB. According to former Israeli intel officer Ari Ben-Menashe, Robert would use his media empire that he founded after leaving active service, particularly his newspaper The Daily Mirror, to facilitate Israeli arms sales to Iran and funneled those profits into banks in the Soviet bloc for safekeeping. There are a few stories out there regarding how Epstein met Ghislaine. One of them was that he was set up through Robert, her father, and Leese introduced him to Maxwell, which is decently documented, and then there is Ghislaine Maxwell's version that she told to then Assistant AG, now Acting AG Todd Blanche, aka the architect of the entire Epstein cover-up, when he spoke with her while she was in custody. According to that story, Ghislaine was working for her father, who sent her back and forth to America on business, and on one of those visits her quote-unquote girlfriend set the two up. Then, after their meeting, she was looking for real estate for her father, and Epstein told her that he also was looking to move and asked if she could help him. She would also assert that Epstein never knew her father, but there is a sizable body of evidence that seems to contradict that claim. What we do know, or at least according to the New York Times, they met around 1990. Robert Maxwell would meet a highly suspicious fate when on November 5th of that following year, while sailing on his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, to the Canary Islands, the crew would lose contact with him after 4:25 a.m. local time. His body would later be recovered from the Atlantic Ocean, nude and with a wound described as a quote-unquote graze on his left shoulder. An inquest into his death in December of that year would rule that his death was caused by a heart attack combined with accidental drowning. He would be given a very lavish funeral in Israel, with then PM Yitzhak Shamir, President Chaim Herzog, and at least 6 serving and former heads of Israeli intelligence in attendance, and he was then buried in the exclusive Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. Just some of his extensive ties to Israeli intel agencies and working on behalf of Israel include playing a crucial role in Czechoslovakia's decision to arm Israel in the 48 War, and his covert work smuggling aircraft parts into Israel, which played a significant role in their air supremacy during the war. As we touched on in previous episodes, he also played a significant role and seems to have made a pretty penny doing so, distributing the hacked and backdoored version of the stolen Inslaw Promise software to facilitate Israeli spy efforts, even selling them to Sandia National Labs and Los Alamos National Laboratory, 2 of the most important nuclear research and national security facilities within the U.S., which is likely how Israel got the plans to construct nuclear weapons in the first place. Maxwell was long suspected by the British Foreign Affairs Office of being a double or even triple agent with connections to MI6, the KGB, and Mossad, and being, quote, a thoroughly bad character. According to Ari Ben-Menashe, Maxwell, along with Daily Mirror's foreign editor Nicholas Davies, were longtime Mossad agents. He also claimed that in 1986, Maxwell informed contacts within the Israeli embassy in London that Mordecai Vanunu had leaked information regarding Israel's nuclear capabilities to the Sunday Times and the Daily Mirror, which led to Vanunu being kidnapped by Mossad, smuggled to Israel, and thrown in prison for 18 years. Seymour Hersh would confirm several of the allegations in his book, The Samson Option. In emails between Epstein, Ghislaine, and others, several mentions of Robert Maxwell come up. Epstein wrote that Robert Maxwell worked for the Mossad and it was his threatening to disclose their operations unless he was paid millions to save his failing empire that was the reason for his death, widely believed to be at their hands. An email dated from October of 2005 from Ghislaine to Epstein claims that she met a CIA operative who quote-unquote worked with her father and could, quote, find all and reveal all for a price. As I previously disclosed during my chapter on Epstein from the Franklin series, Epstein's Israeli ties run far deeper and involve his close relationship with another billionaire and staunch pro-Zionist, Leslie Wexner, whose empire includes L Brands, which encompasses such names as Victoria's Secret, Pink, Bath & Body Works, and Express at its height. Epstein would become so entwined with Wexner that he would soon manage virtually all of his vast fortune. As I previously mentioned, some of his earliest work that I could find that he did for Wexner was to oversee the repurposing of aircraft that was previously used by the CIA during Iran-Contra to move clothing for Wexner's empire based in Columbus, Ohio. By July of '91, Wexner had granted Epstein sweeping power of attorney over his financial affairs, properties, and businesses. Epstein was authorized to borrow money, buy and sell properties, sign tax returns, and act on Wexner's behalf in regards to any and all legal matters. Wexner would be listed as Epstein's sole client of J. Epstein & Company in 1988. He would later rename it Financial Trust Company when he relocated it to the U.S. Virgin Islands for tax-evading purposes. He and Wexner would co-incorporate the New Albany Company in Ohio in '98, which was a real estate development entity that was to be used at their planned community of New Albany outside of Columbus. Epstein would serve as its president. By '95, Epstein also served as a director of the Wexner Foundation and Wexner Heritage Foundation. Epstein had 9 phone numbers for Wexner in his black book, more than anyone else. And Wexner flew no less than 15 times on the Lolita Express, and aside from being listed as a secondary co-conspirator by the FBI, he appears on over 1,700 documents out of the ones that the FBI released and the DOJ didn't keep back or overly redact. Though they did redact his name multiple times and then have to go back and uncover it. Their relationship is the most extensively documented in the entirety of the Epstein files. Before we move on from Wexner, there is one other detail that has bugged me and has been a real thorn in the side of me fully grasping this web of influence and why Les Wexner was such a major component in his rise. In 1991, Les Wexner and Charles Bronfman, another well-connected Jewish billionaire, co-founded what would be the Mega Group, officially considered an informal group of influential Jewish entrepreneurs. Openly, he claims to just meet twice a year for philanthropy and Judaism seminars. A pretty good excuse if you don't want anyone feeling that they can question it without lawsuits and attacks. In reality, they're a staunchly pro-Zionist Israeli lobby group that had existed in the shadows for 8 years until the Wall Street Journal, of all outlets, would finally report on them. One member described the group as having, quote, faith in and devotion to Israel. It might be worth mentioning that they are a U.S. group with U.S. and dual citizenship members. Wexner's money highly influenced the policy and directions of AIPAC and the pipeline that turned Ivy League graduates into advocates and operators for the Zionist cause. Charles and his brother Edgar Bronfman are heirs to the vast Seagram's liquor fortune, and their number one pet project is Birthright Israel, which takes young Jewish adults on a free trip to Israel to solidify their link and, hopefully, their allegiance to the Jewish state. Then there is Ronald Lauder, the cosmetics heir and diplomat. He became Israel's fixer in the realm of global politics and runs interference for Israeli policy whenever it may come under scrutiny. Michael Steinhardt is a hedge fund billionaire who pours money into Zionism-centric academic and cultural institutions and programs. Basically, he ensures that the scholars and curriculums positively reflect on Zionist goals and beliefs and helps to frame the debate, subtle things that further the cause while appearing neutral. Max M. Fisher, descended from Russian Bolshevik Jews, is often cited as a larger part of the megagroup founding, depending on the source. But regardless of the role that he played, he was, without a doubt, one of the group's most powerful and influential members. Max made his first fortune with Aurora Oil, and through successful deals and partnerships, he grew it massively. Max would become a giant in the Jewish community, focusing on a life of dedication to Israel, despite his Russian heritage and American citizenship. He would sit at the head of some of the most powerful and influential boards furthering the Zionist cause. He would work his way into the White House under many presidents, serving as an advisor. His advice and ideas played a central role in shaping U.S.-Israeli relations throughout the years. This list goes on and on. But the more compelling connections and why I brought them up are the close ties to Israeli intelligence, which saw the group as a vehicle for influence operations in the U.S., as well as an easy inroad for espionage activities. Two interesting relationships with ties to the megagroup and deep connections to Epstein are those involving former Israeli PM Ehud Barak and attorney Alan Dershowitz. Ehud Barak also has a long history of work for Israeli intel and received funding from the Wexner Foundation, though was never an official member as far as what documents are available. Among his long history with Epstein, he also invested with him in Carbine, which was staffed by former and perhaps active Israeli intelligence operatives. Dershowitz, group member and strong supporter of Zionism, has been accused by former NSA counterspies of being part of the Israeli intel network associated with Epstein. Every rock that you overturn in this story has at least one strand leading back to Israeli intelligence. And while they adamantly deny those claims, I feel over the course of this series I can prove otherwise. Chapter 4. The Spy Who Bugged Me. First, let me say that multiple witnesses and his biographer Julie K. Brown have said that Epstein had many fake passports and would openly brag about working for both the CIA and the Mossad. But if we've learned anything yet, it's that Epstein was always a liar and a cheat. So can we trust him? If that was all that we had to go on, then I would say not a chance. Fortunately for us, though, we have much, much more to go on than that. To begin to unravel this Byzantine labyrinth that is Epstein's connections, first we need to jump back just a little bit and take a better look at Ghislaine Maxwell. See, Ghislaine was only one of 9 children. While it would take too long to go through all of them, they seemingly all have connections to Israeli intelligence. Twins Isabel and Christine, both older sisters to Ghislaine, have accomplished careers and a dedication to furthering the Zionist cause. These two founded a company that developed one of the internet's first search engines, and later sold it for an enormous profit. Whitney Webb, an incredible researcher, journalist, and investigative reporter, describes Isabel as Israel's back door into Silicon Valley. Haaretz, an Israeli news outlet, wrote in 2001 how Isabel had dedicated her life to advancing the Jewish state's interests, vowing to, quote, work only on things involving Israel, as she, quote, believes in Israel. Isabel would do just that and become a major liaison between Israeli companies in development and private angel investors in the U.S., while also helping U.S. companies interested in opening development centers in Israel. She would use her father's vast network to develop intimate ties to a wide array of Israeli leaders such as Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert. Twin Christine co-founded data analytics firm Chiliad. As its CEO, she oversaw the production of a massive counter-terrorism database that the company would go on to sell to the FBI during the height of the War on Terror, during the Bush admin's habitual overstepping. This software was what allowed the Bush admin to crack down on Muslim Americans, who had nothing to do with it, and erode or destroy domestic civil liberties and privacy in the wake of 9/11 and the Patriot Act being passed. She now sits as a fellow on the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, or ISGAP. On that board also sits a who's who of Israeli national security state officials, and this think tank was the central force behind the U.S. government's decision to crack down on Gaza protests on college campuses nationwide, labeled any support of Palestinians as dangerous anti-Semitism, and met with Democrat and Republican leaders frequently to urge them to investigate organizers of those protests. Needless to say, the Israeli government has and continues to be the group's main funding source to the tune of millions. Other Maxwell kids and even the following generation have worked their way into U.S. politics and policy positions. The Clinton and Maxwell families are very closely intertwined. Isabel's only son, Alex Gerasi, was the first hire whenever she was named as Secretary of State, and also worked under her 07-08 presidential campaign before that. He would go on to be her Chief of Staff at the Office of the Assistant Secretary of State, Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. How would you like to have that mouthful as your job title? In this role, he specialized in developing the U.S. policy, you'll never guess, towards Israel and Iran. Christine's oldest son worked for Obama as staff assistant at the Executive Office of the President. This is just a very small cross-section of what one branch of the Maxwell family has done. Their ties are extensive within the U.S. and Israeli governments and policy-pushing think tanks. While multiple versions seem to exist regarding how Epstein and Maxwell met, the one version that I do not buy is Ghislaine's, and I'll explain why shortly. The version that I tend to put the most stock in is that of Ari Ben Menashe. According to him, Epstein was recruited into Israeli intelligence by Robert early on and was introduced to Ghislaine as he thought that Epstein would make a good husband for her, and that this all took place back in the 80s. According to Ben Menashe, Epstein and Ghislaine were running a sophisticated honeypot trap on behalf of Israel Mossad. He claims that he met Epstein during the 80s while Robert Maxwell and he were still involved in the Iran-Contra affair, along with Nick Davies. This is supported by reporting from Seymour Hersh. Epstein, as I previously said, was also working with Adnan Khashoggi during those years, who, aside from being an arms dealer who was one of the main brokers for Iran-Contra deals between Israel and Iran, also had very close ties to both Israeli and U.S. intelligence services. It would be through those inroads that Epstein would later forge a business relationship with a CIA front company called Southern Air Transport to acquire the former Iran-Contra smuggling planes for Wexner's company. Also, according to Ben Menashe, Epstein's reasoning for always using underage women didn't only stem from a personal preference, but for blackmail purposes due to the social and legal repercussions. His job for Israeli intelligence was to compromise high-level U.S. politicians as well as other world leaders by recording sexual encounters that he would facilitate in order to get compromat on them and leverage over them on behalf of Israel. When asked about Epstein's relationship with Ehud Barak, he broke it down as Barak was going back and forth obtaining the blackmail and returning it to Israeli intelligence. A former U.S. intel official who spoke with the Mint Press in an interview under a condition of anonymity would paint a broader picture. The source had a direct knowledge of the compromised Promise software and how it was used to support covert ops by U.S. and Israeli intelligence. See my series on the octopus for more information on all that if you're curious. And he claimed that some of those funds were made available to Epstein for him to use in compromising targets of political blackmail. He also confirmed that much of his funding also came from Wexner, who had documented ties to both organized crime and U.S./Israeli intelligence. Before I get any deeper into all of this, we should ask if any former spy should ever be trusted. As a general rule, I would say no. As it rests with this case, though, I see no reason that a former intel officer would reveal such damaging information when it is pretty clear that the CIA is working overtime to obscure any connection between them, Epstein, and Israeli intelligence. As far as Ari Ben Menashe goes, I've never fully trusted anything about him, but Israel has done quite a bit to try and distance themselves and to downplay Menashe's role in Israeli intelligence. But independent journalists like AP reporter and Newsweek contributor Robert Perry and Seymour Hersh have both uncovered documents affirming Menashe's credibility. Does all of that rule out controlled opposition? No, but I can see no real reason that it would benefit them either. Israel also cooked up a scheme for the U.S. to deny Menashe entrance on a planned trip to give congressional testimony, and then deporting him back to Israel, where he would stand trial for, quote, exposing state secrets. So there really doesn't seem like much motivation to lie on their behalf about something that only damages their image anyway. On the U.S. side, intel agencies, through their contacts in media, would also go on their own discrediting campaign about Menashe. So it would seem pretty clear that neither side wanted him to talk, not about Promise and not about Epstein. So, through the litany of connections and outright accusations that tie Epstein and Maxwell to intelligence, it gets harder and harder to deny. Glenn Prager, a DOJ investigator working Epstein's case, would also reveal on a hidden camera that Epstein, quote, was an asset for the U.S. and Israel for the CIA. There's the Acosta excuse for giving such a sweetheart deal back in the June 2008 trial that he was told, quote, Epstein belongs to intelligence and he should, quote, leave it alone. While that comment was later walked back, unsurprisingly, it's still one more signal that he was involved in intelligence. And now that we've traced Epstein's anomalous rise, identified many of the main players in this drama, and dug into claims that the whole thing reeks of intelligence activities, the next phase will be outlining his crimes, clients, and co-conspirators, looking into what the paper trail really shows, what evidence remains of his blackmail scheme, what happened behind closed doors at his many properties, and where the bodies are likely buried. Then in phase 3, we'll go over his final arrest, his suspicious death, and with all that we've learned, we'll begin to break down his network, name names, go over the real client list, and take a look at another disturbing network that slipped through carefully constructed cracks. One that just might expose the darkest secret that Epstein and the global elite have worked so long and so hard to hide. This laid the groundwork. All of this is crucial to understanding how this happened, who allowed it, and who benefited. From here, though, we will embark on a tour de force of an ultimate reckoning for all that are involved. So stick around, this shit is without a doubt about to get very real. And that's going to do it for part 1 of this series. I don't have anything prepared or written for this. I just kind of wanted to get on here again and say thank you guys for joining me in this journey. It's going to be very enlightening before the end of it. The rest of these episodes are going to be a good bit longer than this one. Just knowing how dense this was and how it was some of the more, background and less like salacious and exciting kind of details of the whole case, I didn't want to stretch this one out a super long time. So I did my best, believe it or not, to condense many years into this 1 hour or so less block that we got here. In the next episode, we're going to go into everything that happened leading up to his 2005 investigation, 2008 conviction, the sweetheart deal, why he got that deal, what actually were the terms of it all, everything that kind of went on after that, and we're just going to kind of start to piece together some of the main building blocks between his crimes, his victims, and who benefited and what happened throughout the course of all of that. That's going to build into the next one, which will, again, like I kind of said a minute ago, we'll be going into his arrest, his death, his network, the further connections, and everything to kind of build out the full picture of what it is that we're really seeing with all of this. You can go through these documents, and I have, for years and years and years, and never get the full picture. That is by design. If you start trying to piece things together going solely off of what the DOJ released, what you will very quickly find is a wall of redactions and limited documents from certain times that seem to magically correspond with gaps that you really need the information from. Meaning, there's a whole lot of leads and not really any conclusions. So you end up with just enough facts to get an idea or to know that something is there, to have a pretty good concept of what that is, but not quite enough to ever prove it. That was all by design. But I believe that I'll be able to punch through some of those redactions and find some other pieces to pull in. They're going to add a lot of context and really go a long way towards breaking down this entire story. I believe in a way that no one has yet. Hopefully you'll enjoy that. Hopefully you enjoyed this enough to come back and check that out. And if you're not already subscribed, be sure to do that. You'll know when the next one drops. I'm going to keep these rolling in every 2-week kind of gaps here. May drop one a little sooner than that. We'll just have to see. But I'm trying to do this in a way where you guys aren't waiting for long gaps. We don't have to take big breaks so that we're able to kind of keep content coming for the most part as regularly as possible. But that's, like I said, that's about all I got for you guys tonight. Thank you again, and as always, for joining me. If you enjoyed this, if you can, take just a second, leave a comment. It really does help. I don't know why it helps, but it does. It helps the algorithm push these out to a little bit further. And not to mention, I really like hearing from you guys. I will answer every comment that I get. I always have. And yeah, be sure to check out all the links down there. I'm not going to go on and on about it, but there's a lot of resources and stuff if you want to dig a little bit further. I will put out the full document dump for these episodes at the conclusion of them. And it will contain everything that I can legally release. So, look forward to that if you want. Those links always pop up in the Discord first. If you want to join that, it's free to join. We have a lot of good conversation over there. It's been a little slow so far this season for some reason, but I have full faith that we're about to pick up as these episodes get progressively more interesting. In case you guys haven't picked up on this yet, I kind of tend to start these seasons off with what I feel is going to be the most broadly acceptable, kind of easy story to ease into these seasons. And then they kind of just start ramping up from there. This one, it's not going to have nearly as long of a build up before we start crescendoing. It's kind of going to go straight up from here, and then it's going to stay there. So yeah, lots of good stuff to come. I'm excited to bring it to you. I hope you guys are equally excited to be hearing it, because it's all about to be dropping very soon. But until then, take care of yourselves out there. Take care of one another whenever you can. And I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.